flip over to the presentation here. Hopefully you should be able to see that already. And we're going to go ahead and get going. So we're looking at another aspect from this era, and this is a time period where America changed so much. And, I've told, folks that are in class this quite a bit. A lot of people think that this era that we're looking at is probably the one that most closely resembles the times we're living in right now, maybe more than any other time period in history, just because of how much America changed and all the different ways that it changed. And we've spent most of our time talking about industrialization and workers' rights and just all those kinds of things. But another way that America changed just a ton is, we've always been a nation of immigrants. Everyone here, other than Native Americans, came here from somewhere else. But there was a massive amount of people around the turn of the century that came to America from all over the world, but especially Europe. And so that changed America forever. And so we're going to look at a couple aspects of that, but there's an extremely good possibility, probably, above 90% possibility that you have someone, your family tree branches off somewhere in this area to somewhere overseas. You probably have relatives that came here, from other countries around the turn of the century, because that's the story for almost every American. So we'll look at that a little bit more as we go. But this is a pretty important set of notes here. So I'll take the first little set, and then Mr. Anselman he'll take over on the next one. You see just some statistics there from the end of the Civil War to the year 1900, the turn of the century. 13.5 million immigrants came to America. Okay, that is the single greatest period of human migrations. So you understand what the word migration means. That means one or group of people moving from one place to another, and that can happen within a country, but that can also happen from one country to another. This is the most and greatest amount of people moving in one period of time in the history of the world that we're aware of. So why is that? Why did so many people come to America? Well, we have what we call both push and pull factors. So push factors, that people were pushed out of wherever they were. Okay. In Europe and in Asia, there were all kinds of economic problems there, poverty, people were starving to death. Populations were growing because people were living longer. And you would think, hey, people living longer is a good thing. And it is, but that also means there are more people around sharing the same amount of resources. And so then that means that eventually you're going to have a shortage of resources. People were politically and religiously persecuted. Hopefully you know what that word persecuted means, but that means being punished and treated unfairly based on something. So that could be either your beliefs when it comes to politics and government, maybe you're a member of a political party or whatever else, or religious reasons, if people were being persecuted and treated harshly because of their faith. People were also pushed out by just, wars that were being fought in their homeland, or maybe they were going to be forced to serve in the military and fight in wars that they didn't believe in or whatever. All those things contributed to people being pushed out of their country. So then there's also pull factors. So people didn't just come to America because they were being pushed out from somewhere else. They also came to America because America is an attractive place to be. And that's always been the case. That's why people started coming here in the very beginning. And that's why people still want to come here today, and why so many people have come here in between the beginning of our country and where we're at now, because America is a land of opportunity. It's a place where people can, they can worship as they see fit. They can believe as they see fit. They can make their own way, and some people will say some of those things are debatable, but that is the ideal of America. That's what we believe in. And so that's why a lot of people want to come here, because they think that that's true and they want to be a part of it. So to go along with that, there were technological advancements that made this, there weren't planes yet, so you couldn't fly across the ocean in a half a day. But, trips that used to take literally, when people came to America during colonial times, we're talking about months. Now we're talking about days or weeks. And it still was tough, as we're going to look at here shortly. But it was at least doable. It was affordable for people. And many of them sold up all their worldly possessions just so they could buy that ticket to come to America, but it was within their reach, and so people took advantage of that. So you see some other things there. Basically, work and opportunity were here, and that wasn't true of other places in the world at that time. And then political and religious freedom. So you see some things there that really are the same reasons that the colonists came to America to begin with. Those same factors exist, and they're still pulling people here even today. Okay, so we're gonna move ahead to the next slide, and I'm gonna mute myself, and then Mr. Ansmet will hop in here. Let's see if I can. Oh.
What happened?
And we're back.
All right. Sorry about that, guys. Hopefully we didn't bust your eardrums there. You got the presentation back up?
I'm bringing it back right now.
Well, I hope you're all doing well this morning. We're going to continue on here. Mr. Denton kind of touched on this a little bit on the last slide about the journey itself. Again, it was better than it had been before, but nothing of what we think about traveling today. Today you can, and we've talked about this, we've had some foreign exchange students here before and just asked, how's that trip? How long's the plane ride? And it's 10 to 12 hours typically to get from here to Europe. That's by plane. So again, didn't have planes back then. It was on these humongous ships, but it was still affordable, and people were capable of doing that. However, it wasn't, again, most of these people are leaving. Again, we had the pull factors here, but the push factors were what were really pushing them away. So they were willing to deal with the trip, and the conditions were not going to be good. It's going to be extremely crowded. I mean, they put as many people on these ships as they could possibly fit. I mean, they packed them in like sardines. And you think about it, a lot of these ship liners, these weren't meant for cruise vacations. They were built and meant to get people from point A to point B. So as I'm sure you can imagine, anytime you're in a crowded place, things are going to get messy. You're also dealing with a ship. I've never personally been on a ship, but I know I've watched shows like Deadliest Catch before, where these guys are out on the open seas and these boats are just, going up and down. People are going to get seasick, so there's going to be vomit. Restrooms. There's not going to be enough restrooms for the amount of people that they have. So you're going to deal with a lot of offensive conditions on the way. But again, these people are trying to get over to America because life is going to be better here than where they're at. So they got to put up with the journey itself. I don't know, Mr. Denton, if you got anything you want to add on there. I think we've got a couple pictures here that kind of show coming up just kind of how packed and dirty it was.
Yeah, so there's an image there, and again, you probably owe part of your heritage here in America to someone making a voyage like this, and it was, while it was said on a previous slide, it was cheaper, more affordable, and more doable, and a shorter trip. The conditions were horrible for a lot of people, and I don't know if Mr. Ansmet mentioned this already, but I mean, a lot of people had to sleep on the deck of the ship. So they were exposed to all the elements, and you can imagine sunburns and extreme cold and getting rained on, and the sanitation was awful. And so a lot of people that were very brave to make this trip to come here to be part of the American dream, and went through a lot just even in a short span of time to be able to experience that. So you see here a picture that's got the location of what's known as Ellis Island. And I mentioned that a lot of you probably had someone in your family tree that came to America during this time period. A lot of you guys probably had someone in your family tree who came through Ellis Island. And I know that I did. I had my great grandmother came to America, and she's from Ireland. Came by herself. Her parents put her on a boat by herself when she was 14 years old, and came here to live with relatives because they believed that was going to be the best chance for her to have a successful life. So this is what she would have seen when she came to America, and what so many people saw. Ellis Island, it's kind of, you're going to see here the conditions there were awful in a lot of ways, but it's, what these folks saw. They went on this voyage and suffered through that. And then they get to America and they see the Statue of Liberty. And, that's the first thing many of these folks saw when they got to America. So it's kind of this big, awesome, symbolic thing. But then many of them were processed in this place called Ellis Island, which was just a small facility right off the basically coast of New York City. And, it was not equipped to handle the sheer number of people that came through there. And that's why the conditions just got to where they were pretty bad. It was open from 1892 to 1954. In over 20 years, 6 million immigrants came through there, an astounding number of people in that amount of time. And it just was not equipped to handle all those folks. So why does that matter? Well, because the process to handle all those people became this just inhumane thing. The folks that were put through there, first of all, you got to remember that while America is a place that's always considered itself open to anyone from anywhere coming here, we want the best and we want the brightest, and we want people that want to be here and be part of the American dream. And it doesn't matter who you are and what color you are and all those kinds of things. The bottom line is that America is still a place that has issues with accepting people from other places and accepting people that look differently. And that's always been there, even in this time period we're talking about. So these folks were not always treated the best to begin with. They weren't regarded or looked at as equals in a lot of ways. And so that opened up the just the possibility that they were not going to be treated very well. Then you throw in the fact that there just weren't the resources to treat these people the way that they probably should have been. And it's just kind of, it became like I said, these folks were kind of treated like, livestock in a lot of ways. So when they got there, you can see they were quickly herded in, stripped down. They were inspected, much like I said, like farm animals or whatever. They were interrogated about their background. Where were they from? Why were they coming here? And just various different things like that. A lot of times they're, folks' names. And in fact, you may have some of this in your history. Sometimes names were written down and misspelled, and people's name, their surnames were changed forever because of that. They were lined up according to language. They're inspected for disease. They might be marked for diseases or whatever, and they could be put into quarantine because of diseases or whatever that they brought over with them, or for that reason or various other reasons, they could actually be told, sorry, you can't come in. You're going to have to go back. And you can imagine how devastating that would be for someone to go through. To sell everything you own or whatever, leave your family behind, go through all the trauma of that, be on a boat for weeks and just go through all the terrible stuff. And, you've put all your hopes and dreams in coming to America. You get here, you get, herded around and treated like an animal, to be told in the end of things that, sorry, you can't stay, you're going to have to go back. And so that, like I said, obviously would have been a devastating thing for some folks. You can see pictures here of some of these medical inspections and things like that. And again, a lot of this stuff, the medical inspections, the strip searches, basically is what much of it was, were just done out in front of everybody. I mean, there was not a whole lot of privacy or any of that kind of stuff going on. You see here how what I was talking about. I mean, it was just so packed and so many people coming through here that it was. I mean, it was tough going for these folks. So I'm gonna flip over here and hopefully not hang up on you guys this time, and let Mr. Ansman take over.
All right, I want to make sure Mr. Denton got muted there, so we didn't have the feedback. As Mr. Denton said, we consider ourselves the land of the free and open arms and welcoming people, and we still consider us that today, but we still also have the human nature component of not knowing. Back then, especially, you've got people from Europe, as Mr. Dent said, speaking all different kinds of languages, all different types of cultures. We'll get into that a little bit later. But Americans just kind of did not know these new people. And part of not knowing in human nature leads to fear. That's that whole ignorance equals fear. Not knowing how to handle certain situations sometimes can lead to that fear. Unfortunately, what happened then and still happens today, even with immigrants, that fear from some people turns into hatred and stereotypes. This hatred of, I don't want people that don't talk like I do. They don't look like I do. So I don't want to accept them. And then that hatred can lead into, these stereotypes, these different feelings and words of hate that people that aren't like me aren't as good as I am. Another problem, and we talked about this back in the previous set of notes, with an endless supply of workers. That's what the immigrants did. When they came over, they were looking for jobs. They wanted a place to work. They wanted a place to make money. A lot of them would come over, work, and then send money back to maybe even pay off the trip over. But Americans hated the fact of that too, especially once we saw unions form and workers going on strike to make those working conditions better. There were oftentimes people that didn't have work that came over that were ready to work. They didn't care about the situation. They didn't care about the horrible working conditions. They were just looking to work and make money. So Americans viewed these immigrants coming over as competition for jobs, and then ultimately as strike breakers, because sometimes employers would say, all right, go on strike, don't work. I'm going to go find the next guy in line that's willing to work in these conditions. So what we will see, and this isn't every American, just like today, there's people on both sides of the fence that think that we should certainly keep welcoming immigrants. And then you have people that say, no, we should close our borders and we shouldn't let anybody in. We're going to get into that, I think, next couple slides of why it's important to kind of not fall into that trap, as some Americans did back, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when we had all these immigrants coming in. Because ultimately, without them coming over, we probably would not be where we're at today. And certainly on a personal standpoint, as Mr. Dent said, we probably wouldn't be here, because a lot of us can trace our lineage back to people coming over from Europe.
All right. So this is actually just a quote from, I can't remember now where we grabbed this from, but it was in a newspaper editorial at the time. It says the immigrants are an invasion of venomous reptiles, long-haired, wild-eyed, bad-smelling, atheistic, reckless foreign wretches who never did a day's work in their lives. And so, that was an attitude that many Americans carried with them during that time frame. And so that, not all Americans felt that way, obviously, but that gives you a little bit of insight into what some of these folks faced. Literally, we talked about all the hard things that they had to go through just to get here and just to be processed so that they can hope to become Americans. But then once they got off the boat and once they stepped out to the other side, it didn't just magically get easier from there, because they had to face these kinds of attitudes going forward. And that made life hard for a lot of them. Always like to show this picture. It's a political cartoon. And this is where we typically, things are a little bit different right now, but where we usually bring in some class participation to ask kids what they see and what they think. I've shown my 12-year-old daughter this picture because she's in 6th grade now and talking about some of these things. And I just think it's a great illustration. And so, it's pretty obvious what we're looking at here. You see the immigrant there who's, he's got everything he owns on his back. He's not well kept. He's, obviously, had a long voyage and, maybe a person who's lived in poverty most of their lives, might be dirty, those kinds of things. And they've come all the way to America, and he's getting off the boat. And then you see all these fellas standing there saying, "We don't want you here. Go back on the boat and go home." And so it's obvious what the artist is trying to say here about these guys. First of all, you see they've got their top hats on and their fancy overcoats, and they're wearing vests, and they got pocket watches, and most of them look like they're pretty well fed. Okay, so these guys are all wealthy, what you might probably heard the phrase before, wealthy fat cats, those kinds of tycoon type people that are really rich and done well for themselves and everything else. And they're saying, "Hey, we don't want you here. We don't want your kind here. We don't need you here. You don't deserve to be here." But the irony in all this is, you see the shadows behind those guys, that they obviously are here because somewhere along the way, someone like the fella that they're telling to turn around and go back, someone in their lineage came to America looking much like him. You see those guys are all dressed much like he is. And so somebody in their past came here and the same way he did and gutted it out and went through tough times and passed what they earned on down to their family. And these wealthy fellows are the beneficiaries of that. They got a head start because of their family coming to America and making that sacrifice and going through those tough times so they could have a shot. And they started a couple rungs higher on the ladder because of it. And they had an opportunity to do more and gain more wealth because of that. So you guys know about irony. That's what this artist is trying to portray here. Let's see what we got next. Okay. Want flip here?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So if and when they made it to Ellis Island, where did most immigrants go? They went into the cities. That's where the work was. That's where the factories were. So there you see, 1900, 4 out of 5 New York City residents were either immigrants or they were children of immigrants that came over. Okay, so that's a staggering number of people, especially when you look at the millions of people that came over. And what would happen is the creation of what were called ethnic neighborhoods. And you've probably heard of this before. If you've watched movies, you've probably seen like Little Italy's or, I know, when we'll talk about Asian and immigrants out west, Little China, or I guess they call them Chinatowns. But what happened and why these developed was because just like Americans did not know and feared the differences of these immigrants. Immigrants also were coming to a foreign country. A lot of them did not speak English. They spoke their native tongue. And what you had was these neighborhoods developed so that people had support systems. People were able to speak the same language. They were able to worship the same religion that they came over, that they brought with them. So these ethnic neighborhoods provided a little bit of familiarity for immigrants that were now in a foreign country. Unfortunately, with that, it was good that they had support systems, but then it also resulted in segregation. So now you have different pockets of different groups. I know Gangs of New York. That's a good movie. I've seen several times, but it kind of exemplifies that. You have these different pockets of different cultures in New York that came from different areas of the world, and then so they would clash with each other. So, again, good support system, but also created segregation. I'll go ahead and mute here.
This is typically, again, if we were in class, this is where I always love to show. I mean, Mr. Ansman mentioned Gangs of New York. What I think of, which that's a great movie. What I think of, though, is, Godfather Part 2. And that's what I usually like to show clips from that. And I don't know if you guys have, those movies are, those first two Godfather movies are regarded by many people as some of the greatest movies ever made. Part 2 shows just this very thing. When one of the main characters from the first movie, they do flashbacks, and he comes to America. He goes through Ellis Island. He gets quarantined for a while, and then you see later on in life him as a young man, and he's living in one of these ethnic neighborhoods. It's an Italian neighborhood, and everybody there speaks Italian. You go to the theater, and the whole play is done in Italian. The grocery stores and the restaurants and just everything else. It's a little Italy. It's a little version of that. And so it was a huge support system and comfort for those folks. But like Mr. Ansman mentioned, it also, law enforcement was not a presence there. This is where we see the beginnings of organized crime, because the organized law enforcement stayed out. That created a void. And so somebody is always going to step in and create order somehow, whether it's good or bad. And if it's not the good guys, then other people are going to take advantage of it. Kind of similar to the Wild West. Why we had gangs and things like that out there is because, there just wasn't that law enforcement out there to keep things in order. Hopefully you can see this, but this is kind of what one of those ethnic neighborhoods looked like. And so one of the other things you see there is not just, the environment as far as the culture and stuff like that, but how incredibly crowded it was. And that's another issue when you're talking about cities and you're talking about immigrants who are coming to America who have nothing to their name. They're still, America's the richest place in the world, and the people who are poor here are richer than rich people in most other countries in the world. But there were places of extreme poverty and just major issues because of that. Crowding, poverty, sanitation, all that kind of stuff going on in the cities, and immigrants disproportionately suffered from that stuff. So I've already kind of touched on this slide a little bit, but again, they lived in they traveled here in crowded and dirty conditions, and then many of them wound up living in crowded and dirty conditions. I was fortunate, or my family, I guess, fortunate that, when my great grandmother came here from Ireland, she already had family they had farms down in southern Illinois. And so she came here and then immediately moved into the Midwest and lived with her family there. But a lot of folks didn't have that. And so they had to find work wherever they could get it. And so, like I said, in the cities was where it was at. One New York City block, 1,231 people were found living in 120 rooms. These apartments were usually one room no bathrooms, and people were literally living on top of each other. So one of the things that you look at when you're looking at quality of life, when you're measuring quality of life, and America, we like to think of ourselves as having that a higher standard for that sort of thing, but in some places in America at the turn of the century, it was not that way. And one of the measurements, one of the metrics that people look at when they're determining the quality of life for a civilization is, how long do people live, but then how many infants make it past, infancy? How many babies survive, basically? And so at the turn of the century, 60% of newborns in Chicago died before they turned 1 year old. I mean, that's beyond third world country type stuff. So we had America, and we've touched on this a couple of times. America was growing like crazy, and all these advancements were happening, and all this incredible wealth was being created. But there were, there were two Americas at least. So you had all that prosperity going on and people benefiting from it. But there were other places where America was literally a third world country at that time. And those two things are kind of tied together because some folks got really rich and really wealthy by taking advantage of these situations, these people that came here and they paid them almost nothing to do work. And those people were willing to take it because they didn't have anything else. And it just kind of created this awful cycle where a lot of people suffered, because of it. See there some of the living conditions. There was one fellow in particular. I can't remember his name. He shows up on The Story of Us, I believe, and I think are we planning on watching that, Mr. Hanselman, at some point? So they're going to do a big piece on this guy, but he, like I said, his name's escaping me right now. But he went around and took pictures of these living conditions of these immigrants in these apartments, and many Americans just had no clue. I mean, he published all these pictures for everybody to see, and a lot of people were just shocked there was just, people, like I said, just living literally on top of each other, and it was pretty shocking for a lot of people. All right, out west.
Was it Lewis Hines?
That might be.
Well, The Story of Us will cover that. Hey, so out west, you kind of had the same situation with immigrants, only those immigrants were coming primarily from Asia. All right. You got the numbers there. 320,000 Chinese immigrants came to America, and where in the east, immigrants were coming through Ellis Island. In the west, they're going to come through a place called Angel Island, and that's in San Francisco Bay Area. So, we talked about how there was hatred of immigrants in the.
All right, you guys better behave.
We hold on one second, guys. Hey, sorry about that, guys. Mr. Julian, a couple police officers just showed up, showing them the building. So, anyways, not going to get down the weeds on this stuff, but as we talked earlier about hatred of European immigrants, that's going to be amplified in the West because the Asian culture is going to be completely different than American culture. All right. There's very few similarities for Americans to draw to with Chinese culture. So this fear eventually is going to lead to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The United States is actually going to ban immigration from China. All of that, despite the fact that the majority of our railroads in the West were going to be built on the backs of Chinese laborers. And The Story of Us is going to get into this too, of just how dangerous building railroads were out west because you had to deal with the Rocky Mountains and the terrain, and they had to use explosives to break through some of these, these areas to be able to lay and build this track. So story of us going to go into that a little bit more. So I'm not going to get too far into that, but I'll turn it back over here to Mr. Denton, let him.
Yeah. And you see a picture here of one of those Chinatowns. I think this is out in San Francisco, which is one of the more famous ones in the country. And again, you see some of the same stuff that we saw in that picture we looked at earlier. You've taken a piece of another nation and transported it here to America, and that made it a little bit more comfortable for folks, but also made it easier for those folks to be segregated and treated poorly and all those kinds of things. Really do encourage you to kind of pay attention to that aspect of stuff whenever we get to the story of us, when we watch that, just because that is a part of our history that it probably doesn't get enough attention. The fact that, again, we enjoy things here in America. We take things for granted that were done and completed and taken care of before we were ever born. And then a lot of us don't really know or understand or realize the sacrifices that those folks made. And, he mentioned Chinese Americans. I mean, a lot of them put themselves in tough situations and because they needed to, because they had to make a living or whatever. But we're talking about brave folks that knew they were putting their life at risk to build the country in many ways. The transportation systems that we have and just stuff like that. Those things are there because of the bravery of those people. And, again, it's human nature. We take those things for granted because they've always been there, but they wouldn't have been there without the bravery of those other people who came before us. So this is kind of the last slide here. What is the legacy of all this stuff? Why does it matter? And we've touched on a couple of these things. We'll just kind of circle back a little bit here. Many Americans today can trace their heritage back to this era in some fashion. I always like to take this opportunity to tell you, I spent, quite a bit of my earlier years not really having any clue where my family came from. And, my dad's a history professor, and I've taught history for a long time. And, it was kind of one of those deals where there was a separation in my dad's family just because of time. His great-grandfather was pretty old when he had my grandfather, and it was in an era where people just didn't talk very much. He was a coal miner. He didn't really talk about his family's past or anything. And so we just kind of had some legends that got passed down. My grandmother told us some crazy story about 3 brothers coming to America in the 1860s and going in different directions, but just no specifics at all. About 5 years ago, I think it was, I just got kind of to the point where I wanted to know where my family came from and all that kind of stuff. I've never done the DNA, some of the DNA testing type stuff, but I got on Ancestry for about 2 or 3 weeks and did some pretty crazy digging and managed to find out some pretty cool stuff about my family that I would have never known. I mean, the tools are out there now, and I went from thinking that my family came here in the late 1800s to finding out that my 12th great grandfather or whatever, he came here. He was one of the first people, one of the first Europeans in America. Basically, he came here in the early 1600s, and so my family's actually been here. I had a great whatever grandfather that fought in the American Revolution. Had no idea. My grandmother didn't even really have an idea until I told her about that. So I like to tell that story just because, your family history is important. And if you don't know what it is, there are tools out there now, if you're willing to put a little time in, or even if you just want to spend the money and do the DNA stuff. I mean, you can find out a lot about yourself and your past and your history of your family pretty quickly. And it's cool. It makes you, you feel like you know more about yourself and learning about those things. So I encourage you, if you have any interest in that at all, You might already have a family member that's already done some of that stuff too. Take advantage of that. There's a couple other things there. The United States is not just a land of opportunity, but is a kind of known as the great melting pot. We're a country that takes people from all over. We want the best. We want the brightest. We want the hardest working folks to come here and be a part of this American experiment where it's not about, necessarily where you come from or what you look like. It's about, that idea of the American spirit. And if you're willing to participate in that and be part of the team and try to move America forward. And if, that's what makes us America more than anything else, I think, is that idea that America is an idea that we can all buy into no matter what, no matter who we are, and be a part of that and continue to push it forward. And if you're willing to do that, then you can be a part of it. So that's one of the cool kind of things that you can look back on this time period we're talking about and seeing a great example of that. So it's also a cautionary thing to look back at this, because history, it doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but this is a famous quote that it often rhymes. We can take a lot from this time period and see things about ourselves in that time period. Okay, we have always cycled around through time periods of being anti-other, where if you're not from here, you don't look like us, then we don't want you here and stuff like that. But that's just not part of our history. That's not part of America. That's not what America is. It's never been what America was. America is great because of our ideals and our diversity and our willingness to just say, hey, we don't care where you're from. We want the best, and we want people that want to be part of this. So that's just something to keep in mind, because we're always going to face situations where we have to make decisions about those kinds of things. So I'm going to mute myself and let Mr. Ansmet give you some closing comments, and then we're going to turn the recording off and give you guys an opportunity to ask any questions that you might want to, if you have any.
Yeah, just going to follow up on what Mr. Denton said. I mean, our greatness as a country, we are considered the greatest country in the world, and that can be accredited to our diversity. All the different ideas that have came from people that weren't necessarily native to this country. We have to give credit where credit is due there, in all areas of society. Today, medicine, how many bright minds in the medical field do we have that are coming here, working in just the field of medicine? Don't even get me started on all the different food that has gotten here because of other places. So, again, just one of those things to keep in the back of your mind or front of your mind, for that matter, about how diversity is key to America being what it is today. So that is pretty much it here for the presentation. If you guys have any questions, again, once Mr. Denton takes the recording off here, you're welcome to ask questions or join in.
And by the way, I'll throw this on here. So that's just something I keep forgetting to take off there. I put that number on there for you guys, and I think you can put it down at the bottom of your sheet, assuming that's still on the outline. I did that a couple of years ago, so people would not, shut it down too fast, and make sure they were paying attention to the end. So if you want to put that in there, you can. We're not going to be big sticklers on that. So I'm going to go ahead at this point, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen here. And then I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording. You're not required